This is running correctly. Yep. Okay. Good evening, gentlemen. We are, God willing, if everything goes as planned, we are tonight finishing. It's very ambitious to say this at the beginning of the class. We are, God willing, finishing chapter 11 of the second part of the Tanya. That's my ambition. Let's review. From previous chapters, we know that God's traits, His kindness, His wisdom, are absolutely one with Him. They are like the ray of the sun in the sun, in the sense that there really is no separate divine trait. There is only luminary, there is only the sun really present. The very fact that we separate them into different traits, like kindness versus wisdom, is really it's a from our perspective thing. From the perspective of the creation, these are different things. From God's perspective, these things are all one and they are all godly. That's what we were talking about in the previous chapter. In this chapter, the Alter Rebbe has one central thesis. So if you remember this, you can't get lost in this chapter. Simply one point in this chapter. The one point of this chapter is that not only are the divine traits absolutely one with Him in this way, but the divine speech is as well. The point, again, the nakuda of this chapter, the single thesis of this chapter, is that just as the divine traits are absolutely one with Him, so too the divine speech is absolutely one with Him. Most of this chapter is devoted to pointing out how much of a chidush this is. In other words, how wondrous and incredible this idea truly is, even if you can wrap your head around the idea that His traits are absolutely one with Him, which, spoiler alert, we can't really wrap our heads around, right? It's beyond understanding, as we explained at length. But even if you can accept that idea, this idea takes it one step further. It's even more difficult to comprehend. It's an even greater and more wondrous unity of God, right? What do we mean by His speech? We mean, let there be light, for example, right? Or let there be a firmament. And we began explaining already in previous classes on this chapter why this is so incredible. And in short, what did we explain? We explained that God's kindness as a trait, or any one of His traits, His kindness, His chesed, His gvura, His discipline or severity, His chachma, His wisdom, any one of the divine traits that you choose to look at is the source for not just one, not just two, but probably an infinite number of things in the created realm. In other words, the example we were using that I got from Rabbi Yoel is that God's kindness is in Chassidus explained to be the source both of light, physical light, and of physical water as well. Both of these things are compared to chesed. Both of these things derive from, get their nature from, their teva, or their neshama, their soul. It all comes from God's kindness, chesed, right? However, when we look at the divine speech is far more specific. When God says, let there be light, He means let there be light and not water. Water, it talks about a different day. Let there be light, the first day, is specifically the creation of light. What does this show us? This shows us that the divine speech has entered into a close relationship with the thing that it creates, that even the divine trait is not in that relationship. God's kindness is not in as close a relationship with physical light as the actual words of Hashem, let there be light. One of them is the ultimate source of many different creations. One of them is closely connected to and directed towards and intended to create this one specific creation called light. Therefore, when we say that even God's speech is absolutely one with Him, we are making a far greater claim, right? If I want to say God's kindness, the trait, is absolutely one with Him, it's not as difficult to comprehend. Why? Because there's an infinite number of things that come from God's kindness. It still has that lofty, removed, abstract, infinite nature to it, right? If light and water can come from one source, even though the two things are so different from one another, right? That shows that that source is something that is higher than and that transcends the limitations of both of those things. It's something very abstract and very removed. And in fact, as the Alter Rebbe explains when he explains how these metaphors work and how you go from the physical thing to its source in the divine traits, in the spheres of Atzilus, when the Alter Rebbe describes this relationship, he says that you really cannot, good evening, you really cannot logically climb that ladder, you really cannot reach the divine, an understanding of the divine trait from the physical thing. You can't start with water and truly understand its source, which is the divine kindness. The divine kindness and water are simply extremely different from one another. What does the Alter Rebbe say is the most you can understand? He says you have a sweet apple and a bitter apple, right? You have a Honey Crisp, right? And a Granny Smith, right? Sweet, bitter. The sweetness of the sweet apple comes from God's kindness. The bitterness of the bitter apple comes from God's severity. This is what Kabbalah would tell you, right? What do we know from these two apples about these two divine traits? All we know is that somehow sweetness is more like kindness and bitterness is more like severity. But the actual nature of the things we are describing is totally beyond us. We don't actually know the nature of the thing. We only know that A is more like A, and B is more like B. Somehow, the dividing line is there. The Alter Rebbe uses the term b'mezgei. It's the mezeg. What's the mezeg, Ronnie? Like the mix, the composition, right?
That's one translation.
It has like a...
Mizug, yeah.
It has a general mix. It has a general nature that is in some way comparable to this... To this... source. But anyway, that's all an aside. So the divine traits are the source of many things. The kindness is the source of light and water. So if God's kindness is a source for many different physical phenomena and is not defined by any of them, I can wrap my head around how it can be infinite even though it's kindness, whatever that means. Right? It can be as infinite as God, even though we call it kindness, which is what we were talking about in the last chapter. In this chapter, we're saying even when he comes down and says specifically, let there be light, this is a revelation of Hashem that exists to produce a specific physical result in our physical universe. This is the direct antecedent, the causal antecedent, the preceding cause of physical light, right? The two things are directly connected. And yet, nevertheless, the Alter Rebbe is saying in our chapter, that saying, let there be light, is as infinite, in a sense, as godly, as his pure, undivided chesed, his pure, undivided kindness. The divine speech is absolutely one with him. Even though not only is it limited to being one particular trait, it is in fact limited to creating a phenomenon that we can even understand, a finite, defined phenomenon in our world. It is nevertheless somehow absolutely infinite and absolutely one with God. That's what Alter Rebbe is saying in our chapter. That is the single thesis, that is the main point of our chapter. The divine speech is as united with God as the divine traits. Now, we finished but last time, leading into the rest of this chapter that we're going to do tonight, God willing, with the time remaining to us. May I borrow someone's watch, please? That what's different between... So what constitutes this descent, if you will? What constitutes this narrowing of the divine kindness into a divine expression that creates light specifically? In other words, what puts that choke on that infinite potential to narrow it down to one particular creation? God's kindness can produce light and water. But when he says, let there be light, it's specifically light. What makes it specifically light? We said, the osios, letters. It's letters of thought, letters of speech. Letters, not epistles or missives, letters as in the alphabet, right? The letters of the alphabet. Osios, letters are what define that infinite expression and make it a specific one to create a specific creation, right? These are the divine expressions that are recorded at the beginning of the book of Genesis, the beginning of Bereshit. Let there be light, let there be a firmament. These are divine traits that have been brought down and defined and constrained by letters to produce specific named creations. And as we already know from chapter 1 of this work, right, the specific name given to it in the Holy Tongue defines its soul and defines its nature. The letters that are used give it the nature that it has, right? So if we now put these two ideas together, that the letters of the name give it its nature, and that it's the letters which confine the divine kindness, we have an image of what's going on in the book of Genesis. We have a complete picture. When God says, "Let there be light," God has a trait which is called the divine kindness. From his perspective, it's not even a separate trait from the other traits, as we've explained previously. It is merely an expression of his own infinite being, not something fully comprehensible.
Wait, stop for a second.
I can't stop much tonight.
Okay. You just said, when God says, "Let there be light,"
Yes.
and then you segue into the...
I'm explaining the process. When God says, "Let there be light," there is a divine trait called kindness. The kindness it's an infinite divine trait. This is an infinite divine trait from which the light comes. It is the source of the light. However, kindness is also the source of water, or the sweetness in an apple, and probably an infinite number of other things as well. So it's not raw divine kindness, so to speak, unprocessed divine kindness, which produces light, because unprocessed divine kindness is truly infinite. It produces all manner of things. It's the source of all manner of things. So how do you get from what is the source of all manner of things to the source of light specifically? You take that kindness, which is in your heart, right? Speaking metaphorically about God, obviously. You take that kindness and you give specific words to that emotion of kindness, specific letters. You say the word for light, instead of mayim, which is the word for water. And by giving it those specific letters, that kindness is now lowered down to become the source for that specific creation. And that's what we read in the book of Genesis. So when God says, "Let there be light," he is taking his trait of kindness. It's a different trait on each day, 7 days, 7 emotive traits in the spheres, right? The first is kindness, then severity, right? Each day is associated with one of the emotive traits. God has that emotive trait, and then he brings that emotive trait into words, and the words constitute the specific source of that creation, right? So the Alter Rebbe is coming, and his thesis is that even at this level, even at the level of the specific source, at the level of the speech, that speech is one with God absolutely. In other words, that speech is also absolutely infinite, right? Which is a much more wondrous thing to say, a much crazier, much harder to wrap your head around thing to say than that God's trait itself, which is the source of an infinite number of types of things, right, is absolutely one with him and is infinite. So the speech is at the same time limited to be the specific source of light, and yet simultaneously is absolutely one with him. This is what the Alter Rebbe is talking about in this chapter. Okay? So let's talk more about the letters. We're going to read inside, God willing, a lot this evening. So let's go. V'heim. This is going to be on page 977. 977. 977. Second line on 977. Okay? The letters come in 2 flavors. Let's read. There's 2 types of divine letters. Let's read. Second line of 977. V'heim shnei minei olamus. These 2 types of letters produce 2 types of worlds, 2 types of universes, realities. What are the 2 types of worlds? Almen sesimin delay isgalian. The first type of world are concealed worlds that are not revealed. Hem hamishavim v'chayim v'kayamim mekeiches v'amshachos ne'alamis. These are which come into existence and live and are sustained by hidden powers and hidden flows. Kamei eisias hamachshava. This is like the letters of thought. Shebenishmas ha'adam al derech mashal. In the human soul, for example. This is the first type of letter you have above. It's compared, the metaphor for it in the human experience is thought, letters of thought, right? We don't think in the same letters that we speak, generally, by the way. When we think, he doesn't mean just thinking in words, he means all thoughts, which is usually in images or in something even more abstract that's very hard to describe, right? We think in letters. We have letters to our thought, which is not the same as the letters to our speech, but it's the letters that give form to our thoughts, right? So this is what's the difference between thought and speech? Thought is a concealed self-expression. Speech is to reveal to the other. So when God has a concealed self-expression, what does that create? Because for God, right, even his thoughts create. Unlike us, where to have any external effect, we have to at least speak, right? By God, even the thoughts create. What do they create? They create concealed worlds, hidden worlds, right? What does that mean? What does a hidden world mean? I'll give you the very quick rundown on the hidden worlds versus the revealed worlds, right? The common metaphor in Chassidus for hidden world versus revealed worlds is the sea and dry land, is the common metaphor, right? That's why the splitting of the sea, it's a whole party by the splitting of the sea. That's what the splitting of the sea is the concealed becomes revealed. Because everything that exists, it's a midrash, everything, maybe even a Gemara, I'm not sure, everything that exists on dry land exists in the ocean. The Torah teaches us. Everything that we have on dry land, we have in the ocean. Elamai, what's the difference? The difference is, in the ocean, you can't see it. That's essentially the difference. The ocean, everything is concealed in the water. But what's interesting about the concealment of the water is that the same thing that conceals it is the source of life for everything that's in it. Right? Everything that is alive in the ocean is alive because of the water in which it exists. Right? The water, its source of life, right, is the very substance in which it exists. Unlike on land, right, where Chassidus says, interestingly, the source of life is not air. We're not talking about breathing. This is a common place where people get a little confused. We're not talking about breathing. We're actually talking about food. Why food and not breathing is a whole other discussion. We cannot get into it. I'm just pointing out that we're not talking, when it says the fish in the ocean, for example, or the plant life in the ocean lives because of the water, it means its food comes to it from the water, right? On earth, where does the food for everything on earth come from? The ground, the earth, right? But we do not exist within the earth, right? With a few exceptions. But generally speaking, land-dwelling creatures do not exist within the earth itself, right? The food, our source of life, is detached from us, right? This is the perfect metaphor for the revealed world and the concealed world. The letters of thought, no one can see what you're thinking because the letters of thought are contained within their source, the source of their life, which is the person that thinks them, right? And from the letters of God's thought, therefore, he creates worlds that are constantly aware of and concealed within their own source, right? This is the spiritual worlds above. The spiritual worlds above do not attain independence from their own source. As opposed to when God speaks, like we read in the book of Genesis, it's the creation of the physical world, right? And the creation of the physical universe, right, is like the animals on land, the physical universe becomes separate from its source and seems to attain a certain independence. We are not aware of the divine source, which is a theme of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, right? We've spoken about this many times. We are not aware of our own divine source that is constantly creating us, right? So that's why concealed world, revealed world, sea, land, thought, speech, right? All parallel. So the letters of thought create the concealed worlds, the spiritual worlds which are constantly aware of their own source. And what's the second type of world? The fourth paragraph of 977. The almen de isgalyin nivru v'chayim mehizgalu sheniskelu koiches v'emshachos anei alamis. The revealed worlds are created from and live from the revelation of the powers and the flows that are concealed. Hanikrois b'shem esias hamachshava, which are called machshava, which are called thought. In other words, the revealed worlds are created when that concealed life force from God comes lower to be revealed. Yeah, interesting. Read closely the way he's saying it. They're created from the same life force as the concealed world, right? The same divine thought. It's just that divine thought comes a bit lower. That divine thought descends into revelation, and that's what creates the revealed world. Continues the Alter Rebbe, when they are revealed in order to give life to revealed worlds, they are called utterances, the word of God, and the breath of his mouth. Right? So what's everything we've just said? What we've just said is that there's two types of letters. Really, the lower type of letter, the letters of speech, is just the higher type brought down. It's the higher type brought to a lower place, right? Similarly, the things that are created by these two types of speech are the higher worlds, right? The concealed worlds, the concealed realities, and those realities, when brought down to a lower place, creates the revealed reality of our existence, right? So these are the letters which constrain and define the divine traits, right? So when God says, let there be light, when spoken by God, is really just the thought to create light brought into a revealed place. That's what we're saying, okay? What's the significance of this? Good evening. Therefore, what's the Alter Rebbe saying? The Alter Rebbe is saying like this. Speech is defined by, what is speech, right? As the Alter Rebbe just said. What is speech? Speech is a revelation of self that leaves the self. That's what speech is, right? Directly contrasted with thought. Thought is revelation of self that doesn't leave self. Speech is revelation of the self that leaves self, right? That's the fundamental difference, right? The Alter Rebbe's thesis in this chapter is exactly the opposite of what you would think, right? When the Alter Rebbe says the letters of speech, right, make no difference to the unity with God, what is he saying? He's saying that even though speech is defined by leaving the source, going away from God, going away from the unity with the divine, and that's what makes it speech. That's why we call it speech, right? Nevertheless, how much does the speech really depart from the divine? Not at all, right? Even though we call it speech, here you see this powerful tension. The Torah calls it speech. It's speech. The whole reason for the metaphor of speech, why do we say in the Torah, God says, let there be light, right? We say he says it because the action of speaking is the precise action we wish to explain. God leaves himself, he descends from his infinitude, even from the infinitude of his divine traits, and he descends to create something finite, defined, and separate from himself. That is the act of speech, right? Comes the Alter Rebbe and he says, in that very act of speech, whose entire purpose is to take what is not possible in thought and make it possible, because in thought, everything is aware of its source. Now he has to come and speak and make something separate from him, right? So he's not able to think, let there be light, because what type of light does that create? Spiritual light. Light that is totally aware of its source, like a fish is aware of the ocean. Right? He has to take that and make it into something separate from him. Physical, separate, independent reality of light. Right? A physical light. Therefore, he says, let there be light. That's the whole purpose of saying it. If he didn't have to make something separate from him, the Torah would say, and he thought, let there be light, which seems very reasonable for a monotheistic religion that doesn't believe in a God that has a mouth. Right? Thought would be much more philosophically appealing. All of the Greeks would have loved it. All of the philosophy based on the Greek philosophy would have loved it. They all want to define God as intellectual. Anyway, let's call God an intellect. And he thought, let there be light. Much more appealing, right, in a certain school of thought, right? The Torah adamantly says he speaks. He says, let there be light. Why he says? Because if he thought, the Alter Rebbe is saying, the light would be spiritual and totally aware of its source. The whole point of saying, he says, let there be light, is this is an external expression. He is expressing to something outside of himself specifically, something lower, to create something separate, which is deeply wrapped up in the purpose of this act. It must be something separate to be what it is. The creation of the universe as it is, the universe must be separate from God. At least it must appear separate. It must not perceive its unity with God. This is fundamental. So
Is there sound involved?
I seriously doubt it. No, we're not talking about physical speech. It's still God's speech, but the point is that even in God's thought and God's speech, there's a distinction, because thought at essence, right? This is what the Torah tells us. Why does the Torah say speech? Not because it wants us to conclude that there was sound, which doesn't make any sense. It wants us to conclude that there was a expression that is best defined as speech. What is speech? Speech is leaving, descending the self to relate to the other. The whole point was to create a world that perceives itself, that is perceived as other than God, rather than subsumed in its source. Therefore, you would think that at the level of speech, once he has actually spoken, a descent or a moving away from God has taken place. Is that not, according to what we've just explained, the entire purpose of saying, let there be light, rather than just thinking it? The entire purpose of saying it, rather than just thinking it, is to create something separate from him.
In our eyes.
What?
In our eyes.
Exactly. Yeah, to create something that perceives itself as separate from him. That's what I mean.
To us.
What?
To us.
That
We
perceives
perceive,
itself as separate from him.
Okay.
Inherently.
Okay.
It's not just a human psychological issue, as we've explained several times in this class. It's something you have to get over. When we say from our perspective, we don't mean from the perspective of an embodied human mind psychologically, like it's a hang-up. If it was a hang-up, the Alter Rebbe would just say, get over it.
No, I understand.
It's more complicated than that. It's more complicated than that. It's a built-in hang-up. It's God's fault too. It's not our fault. It's God's fault.
Hardwired.
We're talking about how the table perceives itself, and somehow it does this without consciousness, right? That's really what we're talking about. We're not talking about human perception. We're talking about the self-perception of independence, what we call in Chassidus a yesh. How a yesh perceives itself, so to speak, right? The state of being independently created, incarnated. Incarnated is bad though, because that implies only a physical thing can be a yesh, which is not true, right? Embodied is a different term. If you have a very broad definition of body, then you could say embodied is also a good word, right? It's the way that things hang together in themselves, in their deepest nature, when they are created in this state of being a yesh, a state of independence. It's actually a very abstract, existential state. We're not talking about simple perceptions, but the easiest way to talk about it in a Chassidus class is saying how it sees itself. How does the table see itself, right? You made me explain. So,
Sorry.
not at all. If we need to, we need to. So the entire purpose of speaking is to make this separation, is to make something independent, right? So you would think that once he has spoken, where is that speech? The speech is what is creating this separateness, right? Comes Alter Rebbe in this chapter and he says, even in the speech, it is absolutely 100% totally one with God. In the speech, there is no actual separation created by the speech. The speech is not separate, even though it's called speech. So now you have this tension. We call it speech, but the speech is not. It doesn't seem to be like speech, right?
It's no different than thought if you present it that way.
Exactly. In truth, Rabbi Yoel writes, in truth, what the Alter Rebbe is saying is that the entire difference between letters of thought and letters of speech is only from our perspective, right? This is in addition to the last chapter. So I'll say what we said in the last chapter, and I'll say what we're saying now. In the last chapter, we said the difference between the divine traits, kindness and wisdom, for example, is only from our perspective. From God's perspective, there's just an expression of his infinite self. The Alter Rebbe is saying here something similar, at a lower level, which most of the chapter is devoted to explaining how it's at a lower level and still true. At a lower level, the Alter Rebbe is saying the letters of speech and the letters of thought to God are both just an expression of his infinitude. There is no difference between the letters of speech and the letters of thought. This idea that God is actually creating this separation, he's actually creating this state of yeshus, this state of other, this departure in speech from his very self, that whole difference is only what a yesh sees. Right? When the Torah says, let there be light, then, what is it really saying? It's saying that from the perspective of the light, God said, let there be light. But if you were talking about God's perspective, it could say he thought let there be light just as easily. That is exactly what the Alter Rebbe is saying here. Very good. So when the Torah says, let there be fish, or whatever it is, right? It's from the fish's perspective that God even speaks it, right? It's from the creation's perspective that we define this as a speaking, as a departure from God's self. But from God's perspective, this speech may as well be thought. It's the same. It's absolutely one and united with him. Exactly, Ronnie. Okay, let's continue. Let's continue. Bottom of 977. Just like the letters of speech in man, derech mashal, for example, which reveal to the listeners what was concealed and hidden in the speaker's heart, right? That's what speech does. It reveals what was before hidden in your heart, right? So too, God speaks and reveals what by him was previously concealed, right? He makes into the other. He brings down. He separates from himself what was previously absolutely one with him, like a fish is absolutely one with the sea, right? Continues Alter Rebbe, but in truth, the letters of speech above, when God speaks, the letters of his speech, is totally transcendent of the thought of human intellect, of created intellect, right? What's the Alter Rebbe saying? When we speak, right? When we speak, the letters that we use to speak are above intellect or below intellect? This is not a rhetorical question, for once.
What about it again?
When a human being speaks, are the letters that he uses to speak above human intellect or below human intellect?
Within your...
No, that doesn't work. It's either above or below. Because your intellect, when you think, you don't think
It's
usually
below.
in the words that you use to speak.
It's below.
It's below. Why below?
Because words cannot express the thought exactly.
Very good. That's one way of putting it. Words can express thoughts. A different way of putting it is that clearly the letters are merely inanimate vessels for the thought, right? What's the biggest proof? The biggest proof is well, in one sense, you could teach a parrot to speak even, although that's not really 100% accurate in Chassidus. In Chassidus, as we may hint at the end of this chapter, you can't really teach a parrot to speak. That's a separate issue. But a child, right, can stand in for our parrot, right? A child can learn by rote. Really, anyone can learn by rote. But a child can learn to speak words before they even know what they mean. Right? We can learn the letters, right, the vessels, totally separate from any seichel or any intellect, right? Like a bar mitzvah boy reading his maftir, right? He learns the words, he learns the letters, absolutely no idea what the seichel is behind the words, right? The letters clearly are sub-intellectual, right? The letters merely exist to convey the intellect. Letters alone, when you see Mandarin letters, right, for example, the letters alone convey absolutely nothing, right? The letters have no essential intellect to them, right? In general, the letters just serve to convey thoughts. The letters by themselves are meaningless, right? Fundamentally, right? The Chassidus says letters are like stones, literal rocks. The letter is like a rock. That's the comparison. Not even Chassidus. Back to Sefer Yetzirah and Kabbalah, right? A letter is like a stone. Stone, inanimate. Ironically, what's the word for inanimate in Hebrew? Doimem. What does doimem mean? In literal translation, is not inanimate. Doimem means silent, right? Letters are...
Domem. Not
What?
domem. Domem looks alike.
No, doimem.
Domem, yeah. I thought you said domem, sorry.
I thought we were just having an argument over accents for a second. The stone, stones, letters are silent in Chassidus, right? In Kabbalah, letters themselves are like stones, and stones don't speak. That's what characterizes the inanimate. That's what characterizes the stone, right? So the letter itself says nothing. That's the whole point, right? The letter is silent. The letter could be anything. You could use, instead of the letters we use, you could use grains of sand. You could use anything. It's not relevant, right? The letter, all the letter does is serve as a means to convey your thought. Therefore, letters are below human intellect. In God, however,
Are they below? Do they come from the source below? Is it, by way of comparison, the animal soul comes from a source higher than the...
we'll get more to the source of the letters later, God willing, hopefully. In God, it's the opposite. In God, the letters are higher than human intellect. So our letters are below human intellect. God's letters are above human intellect, right? But how do we know? As the Alter Rebbe is about to say, because our minds are created by nothing other than the divine letters. God speaks us into existence. Therefore, the source of our minds is actually from further letters, which proves what? His letters are totally unlike our letters, right? Our letters, you take away the meaning of the letters fall dead, right? His letters, very strange. There's something profound in this. I don't know if I can fully put it into words, but when he has a thought that he puts into words, the words are as inherent to the thought as the thought is. Right? His letters that he uses when he speaks, right, are higher than intellect. They have in them more seichel than our seichel has, right? They mean more inherently. They think. They're actual speaking letters, right? They're not dead. They are speaking letters. The letters themselves, right, are supra-rational. They are above our intellect. For example, the letters of the Torah. Let's do the example quickly. Right? The letters of the Torah, right, are actually, they're godly letters and are conveying something that is the source of human intellect. Not comprehensible by human intellect. Can you understand the Torah entirely? Can the human intellect understand the Torah? We know the answer is no. This is very important in Chassidus. Therefore, the letters of the Torah, not just can we not understand them, why can't we understand them? Because the letters themselves of the Torah are literally above human intellect. The letters, not the meaning of the letters, right? The letters themselves are beyond human intellect. In other words, his letters are not unintelligent. They're not like human letters, which are sub-rational. It's not like reading gibberish, right, or reading Mandarin if you don't read the language, right? It's letters that are comprehensible, right? But they are also simultaneously above intellect. They're incomprehensible. They are beyond comprehension. The letters themselves, the arrangements of the letters, right?
So they have a life of their own?
They have a life of their own. That's a good way of putting it. They have a life of their own. God's dead stones are more alive than our souls are alive. That's essentially what we are. That's essentially what we are saying, right? Let's continue inside 978. Shehare b'maimer ve'osius. Naisa adam b'talmenu, because when God says and uses the letters, let us make man in our image, nivra ha'adam. man is created, Baal Chachma v'Seichel, and he is, what is created? His intellect is created. Ayafilu behevel ha'elyon levad, and the truth is, even his breath is higher than us. K'dichsiv v'yipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, and he blew into his nostrils the breath of life, right? So even the divine breath can create man's intellect. Does anyone have a question on that line? There is a question, an obvious question for even beginner students of Tanya on that line. We say even the divine breath, not just the letters, but even the divine breath is higher than man's intellect.
Everything divine is higher.
What?
Everything divine is higher.
Well, yes, but why are we distinguishing the divine breath from the divine letters and saying even the divine breath, right? When we say even, what's the assumption? The assumption is that the letters, that it's lower than the letters, right? Where do we say that the divine breath is not lower than the letters?
Man who blew the breath in the armor shell?
Very good, which is what? Which signifies what in Tanya?
Part of
The
him.
nefesh elokis, right? It says man de nafach mitoiche nafach. One who blows from deep within him. This is the words of the Alter Rebbe in chapter 2 of Tanya, which even the beginner student of Tanya reaches at least that far, right? Where it says that God blows his breath, and the breath denotes much deeper. Everything else is only spoken. The breath comes from much deeper. Here he's saying even the breath is lower than the spoken letters, and the answer is it's not a contradiction. Here he's not talking about blowing. He's talking about the breath of the spoken word, not the blowing for the godly soul. He's saying, when he says Naisa Adam, and he creates the lower functions of man, not the Pintele Yid, not the godly soul in its highest form, but the other functions of man that are created by speech, just like every other creation, right? The lower, man's biological functions, his lower realities are created by speech. When God says Naisa Adam, let us make man. Those lower functions, even the breath, which is lower than the letters, even the hevel, even the divine breath, is higher than all of the human intellect that it creates. Yeah, that whole statement was parenthetical for those who may have had the question. Okay. Imkain, therefore, what's the Alter Rebbe's point? Let's get back on track. So, what's all of this about the divine speech and the divine letters, right? The Alter Rebbe continues. Imkain, 979 at the top. If so, hadibur ve'evel ha'elyon hu makar ha'chachma v'seichel shebenishmas adam harishon. We must conclude, therefore, that the speech and breath of God are the source of the wisdom and the intellect of the first man, which includes within it all the souls of all the righteous that will come after him, who are greater even than the angels. In other words, this is Adam's soul we are describing, and Adam was the greatest man who contained within him all future human greatness, was contained within the soul of Adam. V'hainu. And all of this is because because the letters of the divine speech are simply expressions of the power and life in his divine traits. The divine traits that are totally united with him in the absolute unity, as we described in the previous chapter, which is infinitely above the mind of the creation. What was the point of this whole discussion of God's speech being higher than our intellect? The whole point is God's letters are not like our letters. When we use letters are dead, inanimate things that we essentially place life into in some deep sense. It's much more complicated than this, as we will probably see, but in some sense, when we use letters, right, like those Mandarin letters, like letters of gibberish, if you mix up all the letters in a sentence so you can't read it, right? Letters are essentially external to the idea. They're external, they're below the seichel. When we say God speaks, however, we are actually describing something else. We are describing simply that his trait, which is absolutely one with him, is drawn down to a lower place. What happens when the trait which is absolutely one with him is drawn to a lower place? Whatever is drawn to the lower place is also absolutely one with him. That's all it is. When we say God says, let there be light, that utterance is just the divine kindness expressed in a further place, similar to how the divine kindness itself is just his infinite light expressed in a different place. Right? So in other words, we have it's from his speech all the way up, everything is absolutely united with God from his perspective. All there is the infinite expression of God. That's all the divine speech constitutes, in truth, from his perspective. Why do we start making differences between speech and thought versus the traits themselves, and the traits are different than each other? Where does all this multiplicity come in? It's all from the perspective of what is created. From the perspective of what is created, we see multiplicity, difference, many levels, many different means of divine expression. From his perspective, it is all just an expression of his infinite self. That is what the Alter Rebbe is saying here. When we read God speaks, don't take the metaphor too literally and think what we're saying is his speech departs from his self. That would be saying God's speech is like our speech. But God's speech is clearly not like our speech. God's speech is above our intellect, never mind our speech. Right? God's speech is something infinite and totally transcendent of us. So even though he says, let there be light, and that statement is meant to create specifically the physical, defined light that we know, right? That statement, let there be light, is itself actually, from his perspective, totally infinite, totally united with him, with none of the limitations that we would think to ascribe to it. Right? Nevertheless, it is his speech to create light specifically.
As is the light.
And how does the, sorry?
As is the
and
light.
Is the light, and that's what light is.
And Keel and Spencer.
And that, well, no, it's what light is specifically, right? That's the thing that's impossible to understand.
Is there any separation though at all between anything that we perceive as created in Hashem?
There are differences, but those differences are differences from our perspective. But when we say from our perspective, again, we're not saying a hang-up for us to get over. We are saying the way that God has made it. Right? When we say from our perspective, we really mean from God creating our perspective. That's the real truth. The truth is, these are two perspectives in God, not a perspective in God and a perspective in creation. Where do you think the perspective of the creation can't arise unless it is also a perspective of God, if you think about it that way, right? Where does it come from otherwise? The perspective of the creation is what God is putting into. That's really the process we're discussing. We are discussing the process whereby our finite perspective arises and is created. That's essentially what we're discussing, right? So we're saying from within that process, right? From within this thing that God is doing, we can see from our end the multiplicity and the division and the different levels and different types of thing. The sweet apple and the bitter apple come from two totally different places, right? From God's perspective, it's all just an infinite expression of his infinite self. And there's a reason why he has created this separate perspective, as Chassidus explains at great length. That's the whole point. But to understand that, you first have to understand why he's done it this way. And you have to understand also that our perspective exists only in as much as it is serving a purpose, right? In other words, his higher perspective, so to speak, that everything is absolutely one with his infinitude, is absolutely valid. The only reason why we see it differently is because we're on a specific mission to do a specific thing. And if we don't need to accomplish that mission, so to speak, or we want to remember for a moment that mission is only a mission, then we can think about how really everything is absolutely united with God and part of his infinite expression, which is the purpose of this part of Tanya. You're supposed to sit before davening and think through all chapters up to 11, right? Maybe not all in one day, or one. Maybe not all in one day or one sitting. We just read the Hayom recently, right, about how Yekusiel Lepler, the Chassid of the Alter Rebbe, would on some days daven Shachris, Mincha, Ma'ariv all in a row with no gaps, right? And when we were in Yeshiva, the Hayom reader always used to remind us, and not because he woke up late. It wasn't because he woke up at 5 p.m. and he had to daven Shachris, Mincha, Ma'ariv with no gaps, right? It was because he spent his whole day davening. What was he doing spending his whole day davening? What do you think he was thinking about? right? This sort of thing. This is teaching of the Alter Rebbe, right? He probably had some form of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. And what was he thinking about? This is what you think about, because davening, right, is like the Shabbos of the day. It's the little Shabbos, right, in Shacharis, and it's to prepare you for your strength for God into the world. And what are you supposed to be able to do? You're supposed to end up like Binyamin Kletzker, the Chassid of Alter Rebbe, who wrote the whole business deal, and at the end, as the Sach Hakel, as the grand sum, he wrote, Einad Movadeh, there's nothing other than God. Right? The difference is, as the Rebbe would always say when he said the story, is that he wasn't just doing it as a trick. He actually meant it. Right? It's easy for us to go and write Einad Movadeh. Right? He actually meant it. To him, all the sums of all these things, all the multiplicity of his business and the workings of the world, and the finite bodies moving therein, right, and all the limitations and all the difficulties and challenges presented and all of these things, at the end of the day for him, what did it all add up to? Einad Movadeh. How did he truly arrive at that perspective? By thinking about this book before davening Shacharis every day. That's the point. That's the point of this book. The point of this book is that you're able to realize, at least for that time of day, a higher perspective. See it how God sees it. Dare to leave your perspective. If you think too much about how God sees it, you'll never want to come back and go to work, right? That's also dealt with in Chassidus at great length, right? That you have to come back, and God wants you to work within this perspective, etc., etc., etc. The bottom line is that's a good problem to have. Try to get to that point, and then worry about coming down. You know what I mean? Introduce something a little higher, a little bit. You already don't want to come down. That's the problem, right? It's a whole other mishagas for a different farbrengen. But so the whole point is that you take this book and you introduce that godly perspective just a little bit. You realize that from God's perspective, all of this is just an infinite expression of Himself. Then you arrive at the question that Alter Rebbe asks in every mimer in the Kutei Torah, right? Which is where you have the famous saying of the Chassidim. The Chassidim said the Kutei Torah asks the same question every week. These are the weekly mimarim of the Alter Rebbe on each parsha and each holiday. Right? The Alter Rebbe says at some point early in the Maimon he has questions on the Parsha or whatever it is, and he says, in order to understand this, we have to understand why the soul has to come into the body. Right? The Chassidim always used to say, the Alter Rebbe just solved this problem last week. Right? Every week came out. Right? The Alter Rebbe has the same thing again and again. We have to understand, why does the soul come into the body? Right? The Chassidim said, why does the Alter Rebbe ask the question every week if he just answered it? He said, because it's supposed to be a question by you, Chacham. Right? We all just take it for granted the soul comes into the body. Right? The Alter Rebbe's whole point is you should be living in a space where this is your most pressing question. Why did my soul come into my body? In other words, why am I here? The reality is that everything is just the infinite expression of God. The sweetness of the apple is just the God saying, let there be sweetness, which is just an expression of the thought, let there be sweetness. And they're the same thing, which is just an expression of the divine trait of kindness. And the divine trait of kindness is no different than any of the other divine traits. All of them are united as absolutely infinite expressions of God. And the way that the traits are united with the speech is in a way of Yichud Ilah, Yichud Tata, the higher unity, the lower unity, the way these traits come together, and how all of this is really all taking place within a tzimtzum that is non-literal, that God's infinite expression itself, before any even divisions into traits, was never really taken away. It's still here. It's just concealed. But God's infinite presence is absolutely here, just like it was before the tzimtzum. Right? And the Alter Rebbe makes it even easier for you to think about all this, because in Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, he doesn't start with the non-literal tzimtzum. He starts with literally the physical world. The Alter Rebbe does it in order. He goes up, right? The first chapter is about physical realities. The second chapter is about physical realities. Then the third is a little bit higher, and the fourth is a little bit higher, and it goes up and up and up, right? But it's all in order. You start with the question, as the Alter Rebbe writes in the second chapter, to answer the heretics, right? And we explain who's the heretics. The heretics is your own animal soul, right? The Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah is in order to talk to your own animal soul, right? He says, first of all, the first problem of everything is that you don't remember that everything is created something from nothing. If you could just remember that animal soul, right, then see what follows, right? Then I have 12 chapters, right, or however many is left, 10 chapters where I can explain to you. If you would just remember that everything is created something from nothing, everything would follow from there. What you're meant to do is sit down before davening with your animal soul and have this conversation with it every day a little bit more, a little bit better, right? Listen, animal soul. Before we get to saying Hodula Hashem Kiru L'Shmai, right? I just want you to know that everything is created something from nothing, right? Even you are created something from nothing.
Korbanot,
right? No, once you can put on your tefillin first. I give you permission. They help. The tefillin are meant to help, right? That's a part of the purpose of the tefillin. So you put on your tefillin and you're sitting there, right? You have your talis and tefillin, and you have before Haidul Hashem Kiru B'Shmai, right? You say, listen, animal soul. 30 seconds, you can say. I just want to let you know, you're created something from nothing. And what that means is that God is constantly creating you. You're not on your own, you're not running your own show here. The very fact that you're not falling through the floor right now is a constant decision of God. If God wanted the floor to not exist, all he has to do is stop speaking it into existence. In other words, what's the conclusion? The conclusion is God is real. God is not an abstract notion. He's not a watchmaker that made the world once upon a time. If God was not deciding every second that you shouldn't fall through the floor, you would fall through the floor this instant. Right? Stop. That's the purpose of this book. The purpose of this book is that even though we are created within this lower perspective, which is defined in so many ways in so many of these different chapters, right? The purpose of this book is to be aware that natural disposition of a yesh, that natural disposition of your animal soul that thinks that it exists, that disposition was created for a very specific purpose, to accomplish a specific mission for God, and does not reflect, not the highest realities, it doesn't even reflect the lower realities, it doesn't reflect the truth of things at all. And this psychological assumption of the animal soul that takes for granted that it exists that is the kernel of every problem that you have in serving God. This is the kernel of the Alter Rebbe's whole project. The kernel of all your problems is that your animal soul thinks that it exists on its own terms, that it is an end unto itself, right? The whole problem is that you bought into this perspective, when in fact it is not a reality per se, it is something that is created for your soul to accomplish something very specific, right? And that's really the whole Chassidus, which is why originally, as we spoke about before we started learning this book, originally the Alter Rebbe had the second part first, in some draft, right? Which we can tell from the way it's written. At some point, the second part was actually the first part, right? Because why should you start learning about yourself and learning about what to do practically, right? Your own nature, which is what the first 53 chapters of Tanya are about. The first part, the Kutei Amarim, what most people just call Tanya. Why should you start with learning about yourself, right? Well, you don't even know the truth of things, right? In some readings. Eventually, the Alter Rebbe decided that the part that is now first should be first. The Alter Rebbe eventually decided that that's the priority. But nevertheless, there was at some point at least, it seems, from the way the Tanya is written, the Alter Rebbe had in mind that this would be the first part, right? The first thing you should know, let me just give you the straight truth. The straight truth is you're not an independent creation. Nothing is an independent creation of God. All that really exists from God's perspective is his own infinite self-expression. There is nothing other than God, right? There seems to be something other than God. Okay, see the next 53 chapters, right? How to deal with that. How to deal with that in yourself, right? But there's the truth and then how to deal with it. Eventually, the Alter Rebbe decided, for whatever reason, that how to deal with it should be first, right? And then we'll get to the truth later. But obviously, the parts of Tanya are interwoven, right? There's philosophical parts of Likutei Amarim as well. Chapter 20 and 21, very famously, are like a 2-chapter summary of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah in very, very brief, in the original part of Tanya, because even in order to understand yourself, you really have to understand all of this, right?
There's a joke.
And the truth is that to really, and the truth is that even to understand the philosophy, you have to understand the neshama as well, right? It goes both ways. They really need each other at the end of the day. You have to have both. You have to have both aspects. I can't remember how you got me off on this rant, but it was very effective.
Good job.
Well, let's keep going until the Fabrangen starts.
Yeah, go, keep going.
We don't have much further to go, the truth is. Okay, let's read top of page 90. Top of page 90. We're almost done with the chapter. 980, pardon me. 980. ולא נקרא בשם אסיאס לגבי הנבראיים, אלא לגבי מדייסב יסברך בכבודן ומעצמן. They are termed letters not in relation to creation, but only relative to God's traits in themselves. Right? What does he mean to say here? He means to say, when we call the letters of the divine speech letters, right? The letters are only letters relative to what the infinitude of the divine trait is, right? They're not letters as we define letters, right? Continuing on the same theme. The letters are really something far beyond our comprehension. Why are they called letters? Because they imply some lowering or some extension of the divine traits themselves. That's why they're called letters. Not because in truth they're actually the same as human letters, right? Okay, now we reach the end part of the chapter, which is a little bit mysterious, but let's read it and then we'll just explain very briefly what the story is. What are these letters? They are the 22 different types of flows, effluences. He says here. I don't know if I would choose that word, but the 28 flows of godly life and godly power that are different one from the other. There's 22 different godly expressions, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. But with which all the worlds are created, above and below, and all the creations within them. Because that is what arose within his will and wisdom. To create the world with 22 different types of expressions specifically, not less and not more. In other words, so God decreed there should be 22 letters, right? Not more and not less. These are the 22 letters which are fixed in the mouth and on the tongue, as the Sefer Yetzirah, the famous book of Kabbalah, sometimes ascribed to Avraham Avinu, teaches. V'tmunasan b'chsav, he says in parentheses, the Alter Rebbe says, last line on 980, V'tmunasan b'chsav, himerda al tzir ha'amshacha kamesh yisbar l'kaman, and their written form also conveys the spiritual form in which they are drawn forth. In other words, as we know, this famous idea, which we'll talk more about in chapter 12, that the actual form of the Hebrew letters conveys their spiritual nature, the different nature of the 22. There's whole books written on just the forms and the shapes of the Hebrew letters and what they imply. The letters themselves, in other words, are spiritual revelations. They have qualities. They are qualitative spiritual revelations, 22 different ones, and the way they're written in the Holy Tongue actually expresses this. Shagam, last line, that even these letters of speech and thought in the human soul are drawn forth from his intellect and his emotions, from their very essence and being, as is explained elsewhere. What is the Alter Rebbe trying to say in this last piece of the chapter? What is he talking about? The 22 letters and the way the letters are written, etc. Right? The Alter Rebbe is saying essentially in this chapter that the letters, right, add nothing to the divine traits. That's essentially what we're saying, right? We're saying the letters which supposedly make this tzimtzum and bring the divine traits into a finite form, really they accomplish no such thing, right? The letters are not really finite, the letters are really infinite, right? So the question arises, this is really the implicit question Alter Rebbe is answering, how can we even call them letters? Right? How can we even really call them letters? Right? Why do we call them letters? Why do we say that when he says Yehi Ur, that those are letters, if the letters are not separate from him at all? Right? You understand the question? So the answer is really in Sefer Yetzirah, as he quotes here, in the Book of Formation, the famous Kabbalistic work. Because what it says in Sefer Yetzirah is not that the letters come from the human mouth, right? He says the letters are fixed in the human mouth. They're fixed in the human kavuim. They're fixed or established, right? Kavua in the mouth of man, right? In other words, the Alter Rebbe here is really introducing just a little twist, something, just a slight complication. The slight complication is that human letters are not as low as I've been describing. I said much earlier in this class, about 40 minutes ago, that I would actually touch on this near the end of the class. The human letters are actually not as low as we've been discussing. Also, when I said that the parrot is not the same as the child learning by rote, is connected to this point. Even when we use letters, our letters are also, the truth is, a little bit magical. They also come from Seichel and Midos. The letters are not the dead things entirely that I was describing before, even though our letters and his are really not the same, because his letters are pure expressions of his Seichel and Midos. The truth is that we can still call them letters. Why? Because even our letters, in truth, if you really think about it, are also expressions of our intellect and our emotions. Why? The letters of our speech.
They're pre-built.
Pre-built is one way of saying it. I'll put it a different way. The different way of putting it is that we never ever learn how to form our letters. The Kabbalah talks about the Hemoitzoyas HaPeh, which we mentioned here, and it's mentioned earlier in this work as well. The 5 points in the mouth from which the different letters come. There's some letters which come from the palate, and some which come from the throat, right? Some which come from the lips, right? We're talking about the parts of the mouth that form the physical letters of speech. The fact is that no one in human history has ever learned to speak by studying the Hemoitzoyas HaPeh. You never go to a child and say, here are the letters that are formed with your lips. Let's go through the different formations of the lips so you can learn how to form these letters. That has never, ever happened. Instead, you say, Kometz Aleph O, and the child is able to say, like a miracle, right? In other words, we all learn to actually form our letters. There's a later part of Tanya, in Igeres HaKodesh, there's a whole letter of Alter Rebbe, the epistle type of letter, not the alphabet type of letter. There's a whole epistle of the Alter Rebbe which talks about this wondrous fact that we can speak. Because the truth is that the letters which come from within us, we already have the letters, as Ronnie said. They're pre-formed. You are never learned to form the letters that you use to speak. Right? You're never taught how to actually form it with your mouth. You hear the sound, right? And you are able to produce that letter. And in Chassidus, there's many more demonstrations of this, right? In other words, the other Maimarim go into like the quibbles that you might have with this, right? Like, couldn't you say, we do learn it, but we just learn it so by rote that it becomes habitual, and then we're able to do it without thinking. Right? It explains Chassidus. There's many proofs in Chassidus for this idea. Right? The mute person who can't speak, usually their Hemoitzoyas HaPeh are totally whole. Right? Their mouth and throat are perfect. Their issue is somewhere else. Right? Chassidus would say their issue is in the neshama. Right? They don't have the ability to bring the letters forth, even though physically they can form them. What does that prove? What that proves is that the letters of our speech are not really purely physical either. When we speak, the letters of our speech really also come from heart and mind, which is why the Sefer Yetzirah says the letters are fixed in the mouth, not they are created by the mouth, right? The letters really begin in the intellect and in the heart, right? It's just that, where do they come into their proper expression? Where are they fixed into the form with which we're familiar? They're fixed in the mouth. But really, the letters are produced from the soul. As Chassidus says, Nefesh Mleya Osius, the soul is full of letters. And when we speak, the soul is actually producing letters from within it. The letters of speech do not come from the actual physical apparatus with which they are produced. And in fact, I think, and I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I think if you actually learn a little bit about contemporary linguistic theory, I think that you would actually find that much of it is actually consistent. Linguistics is very weird, right? The fact that Noam Chomsky is so successful in the field should tell you how weird it is. But
why do you ever praise his name?
Because in linguistics, he's the one that everyone has to take down. He's the guru. And what does he say? He says that totally inexplicably, every human being on earth simply has the ability to produce language. There is no actual explanation for this fact, so to speak, evolutionarily, if you will, or how the people are formed. Basically, people come with a fully formed ability to speak, which is very strange if you think about it, because there's millions of other things that we do that we have to work very hard to learn how to do, right? Everybody seems to just come with a speech module. Everyone just seems to come with the ability to speak. It's totally natural and inherent to human children, right? Which to me sounds almost like something the Alter Rebbe is saying here, Lavdil, right? The Alter Rebbe is saying that speech and letters, really, that even in us, are not as dead, they don't have meaning, they're still less than Seichel itself, right? As we see from the fact that you could just learn something by rote, right? But even that rote speech, when the bar mitzvah boy does his mafter and he doesn't understand what he's saying, right? Even those wrote words, where do they come from? Not from a physical process. They originally originate even in the soul. And therefore, that's why the Alter Rebbe has this last part of the chapter here. The Alter Rebbe is saying that that's why we're justified in calling God's letters letters, because ultimately, even though his letters are totally different than ours, right? Even our letters are expressions of our seichel and midos, just as we're saying his letters are no different than his infinite expression. Essentially what the Alter Rebbe is saying here. Okay, that's our end to chapter 11. Thank you everyone for sticking with me a little over. And we will, God willing, continue with chapter 12, the final chapter of Shaar HaYichud.